or Lakeside HR Group. I'm Kristen Nordling, the founder and president of Lakeside HR Group. This is my first time. I know, I think it was last month, it was Becky's first time facilitating Lakeside Chat. We have some big shoes to fill with Erin, and she has set the bar very high. But thankfully, I have a great guest that will walk me through this, and I don't have to worry about being perfect, right, Amelia?
No, you do not.
So I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Amelia Reigstad. Dr. Amelia, I'll just give a little bit of a bio, and then I'll have you introduce yourself as well. She's a #1 best-selling author, keynote speaker, and facilitator with love of knowledge and passion for empowering women to use their voice to initiate change. With over 2 decades of leadership and communication experience across industries, she enjoys sharing her expertise through keynote speaking, training programs, and workshops. Over the course of her career, she has authored numerous articles on gender, communication, leadership success, and authenticity. Her second book, Hello, Mrs. Perfect, here it is, or Ms. Perfect, empowers readers to shed the pressure of perfection and buck the system. She is also a Twin Cities Business Magazine notable woman entrepreneur and founder of the Women Empowerment Series and the Women Collective, which is a curated retail experience in White Bear Lake, Minnesota. And we were just talking about how I need to get up to that side of town. Being in the South Metro, it's a little bit more difficult. So welcome, Dr. Amelia. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And I don't even know if I have anything else to say from an intro perspective because you covered that off well.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, for those of you that are new to Lakeside Chat, we do have some rules of engagement. This is a public session that is recorded. The recording will be posted to Lakeside HR Group's website for future viewing. So if you missed something or you want to share this, you can download and share the link to others. You can use all the team's features to engage and share your voice throughout. So please make sure you're, chatting. We like these to be very engaging sessions. So this isn't just a sit and watch. If you have questions or you want to ask a question, or if you have a question or you want to make a comment, please do. Erin is going to be helping us with the chat. We encourage positive discussion and genuine curiosity, which is very much in line with our values at Lakeside HR Group. And many times there's no right answer, and that's okay. The goal is information sharing and conversation starting. So we are going to get started. We're going to jump right in to the topic with this question. When you hear the word perfectionism, what comes to mind? I'd love to hear what others are thinking when they hear this word. But I want to talk a little bit while people are putting some notes in the chat, why this topic matters to us at Lakeside HR Group, to me personally, and why we think it's important. There continues to be increasing pressure for individuals to meet unrealistic standards in life, work, and socially. And I also think it's important to talk about how perfectionism affects workplace culture, leadership, productivity, and well-being. We really need to understand the importance of shifting from perfectionism to excellence for sustainable success. So, Erin, what do we've got in the chat?
Oh, I think all the words you'd expect. So we've got things like not enough, fear, critical, inauthentic, not being finished, mental health, never feeling good enough. I think there's all sorts of words that I think you think that it's a positive word when you think something is perfect, but really at the same time, I think we're starting to hear the tone of negativity through the words that people are sharing.
Yep, absolutely. So, Amelia, how do you define the difference between perfectionism and excellence? And when you see those words, what comes to mind?
Absolutely. So, perfectionism is really considered a personality trait. Okay. And now the challenge with saying that, and that's backed by research, that we would consider perfectionism rather as a personality trait, is that personality traits are generally fixed characteristics, meaning that we can't change them, right? We can't modify, we can't adapt. However, with perfectionism, I feel like, there's some things that we're going to come to that will explain that a little bit more. But perfectionism is really characterized by these high expectations, high standards, and research will say generally influenced by ourselves. So that internal pressure that we put on ourselves. Okay. That being said, though, it also comes from a variety of other areas too. So if we think about, our childhood, right? I am a big proponent of the number one pressure, and where that comes from is from society, patriarchy, and then yes, of course, ourselves, really has us striving to be this perfect perfectionist, when quite frankly, that doesn't exist.
Great. I remember when you talked about childhood, and I love my parents. They're wonderful people, and they raised me my brother and I very well. But I remember we'd bring the grades home, and I would have like 3 A's, a B, and then a C, sometimes a D in there. But they would focus on that. They would focus on the D. They wouldn't focus on the fact that I had the A's. What did you do wrong to get the D? And I remember that feeling of always having to, live up to that. And I think it's interesting that you bring that up.
And on the flip side of that, Chris, and something that I discovered through writing the book, Hello, Miss Perfect, in my first chapter is the perfect daughter chapter. And we'll right. And we'll talk more about this as we go along of kind of, of certain things, but I didn't feel the pressure to be perfect from my parents, which was really interesting, because in writing the book, I thought and always knew that the title would actually be The Perfect Daughter, because I always felt like I was the perfect daughter. Not that I'm perfect by any means, but it's because I'm high achieving, right? And that leads us into really the differences between perfectionism and excellence. So everyone on the call, I really want you to think about these differences, right? So perfection, right? It's about failure. It's linked to failure. It is about caring and thinking to ourselves, what are people going to think? What are people going to think about me? We've got doubt. We've got fear. We can get angry and frustrated. There's judgment there. There's control, right? Some of those words that came up in the chat. Excellence, though, however, right, is striving for success. Right? So when we look at excellence, we're confident, right? We tend to take more risks. We can accept criticism, right? We can say to ourselves, like, okay, yeah, I'm willing to be wrong on here. We're accepting, right? It's natural. So in my journey, yeah, sure, I always thought that I was a perfectionist. Hey, but writing and going through my book journey, I'm like, nope, high achiever, and absolutely follow along the excellent side of things.
Interesting. It's super powerful when you start to notice that difference between perfection and excellence. And to Erin's point earlier in the chat, it was a lot of negative when you're striving for perfection and excellence. Look at the positivity around that. The taking risks, and that not being afraid of failure, learning from those things. Being very accepting, and it's okay to be wrong, and self-aware. So no, I think those are all very good differences.
And just one quick thought there too. When we think about, kind of perfectionism as well, like it's about having these unrealistic standards, and that sets us up for failure immediately because it is not attainable. Right? We're not perfect individuals. Right? So I want everyone too to start thinking about, where you align yourself. Like, are you truly a perfectionist, or are you high achieving, striving for excellence? Right? Because that's the theme that we're going to be talking about throughout our time here today.
Right. So I would love, again, throw it out to the chat. Where do you feel the pressure to be perfect? And I think a lot about being a business owner, and not knowing all the answers. That can be really, really intimidating, because everyone looks to you as the owner, the final decision maker in a lot of things. And a lot of times I don't know the answers. So there's that pressure as a business owner. There's a pressure as a leader. There's a pressure as a parent. And, I would be interested to hear what some of the others are saying in the chat as it relates to where you feel the pressure to be perfect.
Well, I think the ones that you've called out, Kristen, are the ones that we're seeing, right? So parenting, mothering, business owner in business. There's obviously ongoing similarities there in terms of what you've shared as well. Ones I like now are things that, like even what Steve had said about the idea of leading a team. So it's not just about being a business owner, but in terms of being a leader in at work is another one I think is sort of an interesting one to hear.
Yeah, and I'd love it if somebody in the chat would like to explore that a little bit further. Why is it that, you feel the pressure to be perfect when you're leading a team or as a leader within your organization? Where is that pressure coming from?
Steve, would you feel comfortable taking yourself off mute and sharing a little bit more about what you mean when you say leading a team? Others that are coming in is working on culture that we believe perfectionism drives positive results versus understanding the downside of it on our teams, I think is one that Missy talks about.
And I love that because it's actually the complete opposite. And we're going to talk more about that a little bit later. But when we have these perfectionist tendencies, it's the exact opposite. We're not driving positive results.
Right. I can remember leaders in my career where they were striving for perfection. And I think, one of the things that I have worked really hard on and our leadership team has worked very hard on in our values here is 80% is okay, because we've got to keep moving, and that analysis paralysis that can come in when we're starting to go down that path of perfectionism too.
I think too, I'm even reading what Betsy had written here, is the concept of wanting to let others down. I think that is the other driver. As Amelia, you asked the question about what drives that piece of it, is when we're in a position where we feel like we're responsible for somebody else. We don't want to let other people down. Is that fear of perfectionism as well?
Absolutely. It's that fear of failure, which is absolutely associated with the definition of perfection.
Yeah, and I see Deborah's comment to agree that perfectionism can come across as harsh and unforgiving, which I would agree. I had that with a leader, and that I never felt like I could live up to the standard that he wanted, and it can be really tough. So
yeah. I love though too here, sorry, just quickly what Becky is saying though, as a leader, when you're personally driving for perfectionism yourself, you often start to hold other to the standards you were setting up for yourself. Right. And that's a great take as well, Becky, because, as leaders, especially when we're talking about perfectionism and leading our teams, we do have to be careful of that. We have to ensure that we're leading by example, especially if we want our teams to be a certain way as well. So kind of checking in and again, going back to well, where does that perfectionism tendencies come from? What's the root cause of that?
Right. I love Julie's comment of, so many work environments strive for nearly perfect when roughly right works as well. So I like that as well. I like that saying. Let's talk a little bit.
I love alliteration.
I know, me too. So let's talk about the perfectionist path in their career, and I think we're seeing some of those signs of perfectionism in the workplace, but how does it impact confidence, leadership, and decision making, Amelia, from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it does because it fosters this fear of failure, right? It does lead to that paralysis or analysis paralysis, rather, where we're thinking so hard about something, we're trying to do something to ensure that it is perfect when it's not attainable. It is not attainable at all. We start to procrastinate because we want everything to be perfect, and we just get so stuck in that.
So it's not just ADHD.
No, right? Ultimately, when we think about perfectionism, it's hindering our progress. It's hindering our innovation because we get so stuck kind of in this like ideology viewpoint that perfectionism actually exists and that it's a benefit. Right? And it's not necessarily a benefit. And that's where the conversation like really needs to shift to like, are we talking about perfectionism? Or are we talking about excellence and striving for success? Because there is some differences there.
100%, 100%. You know, how can leaders help in that, you know, working through that when they're starting to see that in their team? Maybe they're not the ones that are expecting perfection. How can they help?
Well, I think too with that, I would encourage leaders though to also check themselves, right? And be really authentic and real as a leader within an organization, because that perfectionism tendencies that you may see in your teams, quite frankly, that pressure may be coming from you. And you may not realize it, right? Micromanaging a team, right? Impairing decision making, right? That all can impact kind of what your teams are working on and them kind of picking up these perfectionism tendencies. So with leaders, like leading by example, and really, you know, like having those conversations. And that's why I love, you know, I've been so fortunate over the last couple months since the book has come out that I've been doing a lot of speaking about perfectionism, because we don't really talk about it all that much, right? We don't talk about the differences between perfectionism and excellence. And there's certainly something to be said. And again, going back to like, what is that root cause? Right? So we know society will tell us we're not doing a good enough job if we're not working 50, 60 hours a week, right? There's that crazy culture in the US of overworking until we burn out, right? So that's where, too, we have to kind of look internally and try to figure out and challenge ourselves to learn where that pressure to be perfect is coming from, because it's not black and white, right?
Well, but you look back to, you know, where it may have come from, because, you know, the one thing that I'm curious about is, you know, can you coach someone out of perfectionism when you know that you're trying to create an environment where excellence is really important to, or progress over perfection, but you see somebody really struggling with that? What are some things that a leader could, you know, do to help an employee see through that and work through that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel that it's about, like, again, you know, my background is in communication, so it's having, you know, those real, honest, truthful, transparent conversations about like, hey, like what's going on here? Like, you know, I'm noticing that you're striving really, really hard to meet this project deadline. You know, however, we've got some wiggle room here, right? Like, I actually want you to go home at the end of the day, right? 5 o'clock, you know, go home and enjoy time with your family. So having those conversations, right? And bringing up, I mean, it's sometimes hard, I feel, because again, we don't have a lot of conversations about perfectionism. And I'm not sure too. I mean, leaders, maybe you could pop, you know, something into the chat. Like, could you have a conversation? Like, do you feel like you could sit down with your team and have a conversation about perfectionist tendencies? Like, is that a conversation that takes place in the workplace? You know, I'm kind of removed from, you know, working for an organization because I work for myself. So it's me, myself, and I. But I kind of like, Kristen, Aaron, your thoughts, or then even in the chat, like, what would that look like if you're identifying some of these perfectionism tendencies? What would you do with that information?
Well, I've experienced it, you know, as a leader too. And one of the things that I tried to do as well is help celebrate drafts. You know, like if I get a draft, like, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. You know, let's work through it. And not, you know, I think finding ways to set expectations on versions, maybe if you're working on a PowerPoint or if you're working on some type of presentation or some type of document, helping them see that, you know, what they're doing along the way is good. And deadlines, I think, are super important too, in these cases as well.
Yeah.
I want to just call out a couple of things that are coming through the chat. So one of the things I don't want to lose sight of is what Becky talked about is the leader overthink, is the ability for us to be able to know that we don't want to create perfectionists, yet at the same time, we want things done, right? There's this sort of like ongoing internal overthink that we have going on in our heads as well, which I think is something I think is a fair statement, right? We know that exists. We sort of know our own perfectionist tendencies, yet it's easy to get yourself kind of caught up in that overthink thought process.
Right. I love Julie's comment. I was like, oh, this is perfect. Sounds like an excellent brainstorming topic for a strategy planning session. How does perfectionism impact our goals? I love that, Julie. What a great idea to be able to call it out and talk about it too. And then as the leader, be able to support that discussion.
Yeah.
And Julie, I can come facilitate that session for you if you're interested.
Well, and I do think that, having that external facilitator is important, because then the leader is even part of that discussion.
A couple others talk about the concept of modeling the way, which I think is important too, right? The idea of calling out your 80% kind of along the way too. Yeah. And then I think the idea of looking for opportunities, I think what Missy talks about is the idea of experimenting, trying, failing with your team, sort of the idea of living in that space of experimental mindset. It allows people to sort of see it and watch you sort of model that opportunity at the same time as you're working with your team.
And I really like what Andrea says here too, right? I think it's hard to tell someone as a leader that a team member has a problem with perfectionism. Like those conversations would be really, really difficult. That would lead towards a lot of conflict.
Yeah.
Right. So being cognizant of that. I love that, Andrea. Thanks for sharing.
So I'd love to engage. I love the activity in the chat. So thank you, everyone. And here, throwing out another question is, where do you notice perfectionism showing up in your work? I mentioned the kind of the analysis paralysis, the fear of starting the work, the fear of, finishing. And, the end goal too is not meeting the goals. So if you have goals in a company and you're not meeting those goals, taking a hard look to say, am I expecting too much in my team to meet these goals? And they're fearful. They're not taking, they're not, showing that confidence that you would expect in excellence. I'd be curious in the chat, as well as if there's any other areas where you notice perfectionism showing up in your work. And Amelia, any thoughts that you can share with the team on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think too, one of the kind of results of seeing that perfection is in the workplace is around that high stress and anxiety. Right? Because that creates, again, and then it goes back to aligning and linking perfectionism with this fear of failure.
Right. I also think that there's tools that, with the use of AI right now to get people started, sometimes is a way to just help people see that, it's just that start to be able to get the work going. So this is one that we talked a lot about in our prep call too, that work-life balance. Is it achievable or a myth? And I know that's been a topic that's been out there since the beginning of time. Oops, we got a background noise here. So Amelia, is work-life balance a myth or is it achievable?
I would actually love folks to pop something into the chat for this one, and then I'm going to go off of that, because I have some very strong thoughts on this, but I want to hear from everybody else first. So what do you think? Is it achievable or forget it?
Previous question too, because I think what Julie mentions too is a fair one. The idea where perfectionism shows up at work, she talks about it stopping the ability to delegate, right? When you worry so much that you're going to you're the only one that can create it the way that you want it to look, it can prohibit people from feeling comfortable letting somebody else do the work, which I think is totally a fair statement. So now going back to this question, sorry, so I didn't want to lose sight of
and I think that's a perfect example of how it can be unachievable, is if you can't delegate and you are taking everything on, it's not achievable.
So I think
love-
we've got Jennifer's statement of right is we've given up on the concept of balance, and now we've just leaned into the concept of harmony, which is a great statement. I love what Nick says here is the idea of that it looks different day to day, right?
Mhm.
Some days might mean more work, some days might mean more life. And so I think the idea of expecting it to be a consistent equal parts is unrealistic, but to know that you're living in a day to day is fair.
I would say that for me, I love that day-to-day comment or week to week. A couple weeks ago was the first week that I had left the office before everybody else, it felt like. And it was like, not that that was a good or a bad thing. It was just like, whoa, I had things going on in my life that week that I needed to be at. And I felt at peace with leaving when I left. I think it, also as a leader sets a good example. But I think figuring out what work-life balance means for you or what harmony or however you need to look at it, it's important you look at it what it means to you.
Yep.
So, and I want to back up a little bit with this conversation because yes, and I'm agreeing with what comes in the chat. We've got work-life balance, we have integration, we have harmony. It has turned into a bit of a buzzword, and folks do have really strong opinions on whether or not this whole idea of being able to balance our life with our work can even exist. Okay, but I want to go back again to the source. Okay, so very much like I was talking about, like where the pressures to be perfect comes from, right? Burnout, as an example, is systemic, right? It might manifest in us, it might manifest in individuals, but burnout is systemic. It starts with our industries, it starts with our organizations, and unfortunately, leaders, it starts with you, right? If I'm going to be calling a spade, that's where this whole concept of burnout exists. And that's a medical definition, right? Burnout is systemic. It manifests in individuals, but it doesn't originate with us, right? It's all this noise in the background that is telling us that we have to work so hard, that we have to do this, we have to do that. And very much like perfectionism, those pressures is all coming from that noise around us.
Yeah, agreed. I like Missy's comment here too, of putting her energy for the most impact in her teams, giving grace that I'm doing my best. There will always be more work and things to do than hours in the day.
Absolutely. And two, like that whole idea of the work-life balance, and somebody did pop that into the chat, right? Like it ebbs and flows, right? So some days, yes, we are going to be busier than others, right? But think about too, burnout, right? Because if we don't have that work-life balance, right, that's what it's going to lead to. But burnout is not being busy, right? Burnout is really about like chronic issues, right? That is stemming from systemic challenges within the industry or organizations that we work in. So, Kristen, I'd love for you to chat then about this work-life balance matrix and see what folks think about it.
Yes, because this, when Amelia brought this forward, I was like, okay, what is this? Is it different categories on where you're looking at that work-life balance and how to achieve it? And so you had developed this matrix to help people look at this in a different way. So highlighting the areas in which you need maybe that balance. Do you want to give those
absolutely. And I think
examples?
Based on our time, we might have a few moments if folks want to give some thought to it and pop something into the chat if we can. So ideally with this matrix, and this is something that I use in a lot of my burnout balance sessions, and then it's also in the book Hello is Perfect as well. So why I designed this was because I wanted folks to figure out like, where is the gap in your life, right? So how this matrix works is jotting down kind of all of your day-to-day responsibilities, right? So what are you responsible for at work, right? What relationships, personally, professionally, are you responsible for? What tasks come out of that? What's your health like? What is your family responsibilities like? Who takes care of the finances? Who pays the bills, within your family life, your personal life? when I did this, for me, it was like, gosh, like my gap was fun. Like I wasn't having any fun. I wasn't doing anything, for me or self-care. So that's kind of how that work-life balance matrix works, is really trying to identify where that gap is for you. And generally, it does stem from, or not stem from rather, what comes out of it is folks are worried about health. Right. So that's a gap for people taking care of themselves, getting out for walks, going to the gym, and then having fun, like doing things for ourselves, going out on date nights, going mini golfing with our kids, so it's a really good exercise to kind of pinpoint that gap and then really start to articulate whether or not you have that work-life balance, integration, harmony. Because we all seek that, right?
So
we
I
don't
played
want to
around
work 24/7.
Yeah, I played around with this and it was a little eye-opening for me. And I knew, I mean, some of it is, where that gap is, especially when maybe the work is more on the high side versus the life side. But yeah, when I saw this, I was like, okay, health is one of the big ones for me. I mean, that was always, it has been a priority, for a big chunk of my life. And I always had made sure that, I remember talking on a panel that, Monday, Wednesday, Fridays are my Pilates days, and my team knows, and I know that if I don't get Pilates, it'll be tough. Well, that's kind of started to go by the wayside, and I can feel the difference in myself. And so, speaking from a vulnerable perspective, I would absolutely say that is one of those areas that I need to get back to focus on. And I see a couple questions here. Where does faith fit into the matrix and
And I'm happy to
spirituality?
answer that
Yes.
as well. So and I don't know if I've got it in just the book here. In my actual kind of template that I use, I also have a list of all other categories as well. So you can really create your own. If faith is part of your life, if spirituality is part of your life, you can add that in to the matrix, and then kind of decipher what are those responsibilities for you. Right. So Lori, Andrea, I hope that answers your question. You can kind of create that matrix kind of pertaining to what you have in your life. Maybe there's volunteer work that plays a role for you, community, faith. So all good examples of those categories, and you can really make it your own based on kind of where your roles and responsibilities come to fruition.
Can I also just call out, I think it's interesting that there's 6 boxes, yet we only ever talk about work and life, and work is one of the 6 boxes. So when we think too about where we consider balance or boundaries, as others have sort of called out in the chat, that like work is really just one of 6, not
or 7 or 10 or 12.
Right. It's not one of 2. And I think that's another interesting, just a visual call out as I look at that piece of it, and I start to just to consider the numbers of it all and the boundaries that even as you talked about, Kristen, even just where you set your boundaries of time, that's an interesting element to it. So I just wanted to call that out as well.
Yeah, that's an awesome observation, Erin.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought about it, about adding to it as well, because I could probably lump family and relationships, together, family, friends, relationships, and then adding, community or whatever that is that's important to you. So I think that was a really good question, as well as call out.
I want to just I don't want to lose sight of what Julie talked about with boundaries. And I know boundaries was mentioned before as well. And it kind of goes to what Kristen was referring to. And so, Amelia, I wanted to just call that out to you as well, as people are thinking about this concept of being perfect, right? We often affiliate perfection with time and the amount of time we're spending doing something, the amount of time we're spending with our family, or the amount of time we're spending as well, and sort of bucketing that time piece of it, and boundaries play a part. So I just wanted to just get your insight on the timing element, as well as the where are boundaries needed versus where should boundaries be more fluid?
Yeah, creating boundaries is really, really an important component to this whole conversation of balance, perfectionism, etc. And even just kind of going through this list on the screen, the number one bullet point for me, and this kind of goes back to some of the earlier conversations, is learn to say no. Right?
Mhm.
That is how we start to set boundaries, right? So no is a complete sentence. And not a lot of people recognize that.
I love that. No,
But no,
my kids would have said that back in the day.
right? But it is a complete sentence. And
Yeah.
yes, of course, a lot of the times we have to say no. However, I can add that to my to-do list for next week. But right now, actually, it's 4:30 and I got to go. My kiddo's got soccer and I got to get there.
Yeah.
Right? So being able to say no, because goodness, does that ever free you up?
Oh.
It frees you up to make those decisions and be confident in those decisions that you make. And then also part of that creating boundaries is the delegation piece. Okay? However, we also have to be cognizant of, if we are going to delegate, right, in order to set these boundaries, we also have to give up control. Right? So as leaders, right, if you're going to delegate something, if you're going to set those boundaries, we do have to trust our team members. We do have to give up that control, right? Personal example, and this is the one that I share all the time. Between my husband and I, generally, I'm the one that does the grocery shopping. I'm the one that generally cooks dinner. I'll go to Costco on a Saturday. And we were struggling, like we were having some of these conversations where there wasn't this balance kind of in our household responsibilities. And I really needed to set some boundaries to keep my marriage from not crumbling. I mean, that's a little bit dramatic, but from just not being as good of a place as I would want it to be. And I said, hey, like, I need you to go to Costco this weekend and you do the shopping. Okay, so I did that. And I damn well knew that he was going to spend more money and he was going to come back with a lot of things that either were not what we typically buy or weren't on the list. But I gave up that control and I had to stick with that because that freed me up to probably go golfing with Aaron, right? Or doing something fun that is important to me, right? Going back to that matrix, I wasn't having as much fun. But heck, I said no to grocery shopping and I delegated it to my spouse. And look what happened.
And you know what? It's not going to be perfect, and that's okay. But
Absolutely.
being okay and checking yourself on that, because there are so many times where, especially, as working parents, I don't care if it's the mom or the dad, you want to contribute. You want to be able to be that person that can contribute in the household. And that personal example is a great one. The no, I love that one too.
Mm-hmm.
I always feel like I need to give an excuse, and I'm working really hard now that I'm in my 50s. I'm feeling a little bit more confident in my own skin about saying no, and I can't do this, and not feeling like I have to give all the reasons why. Sometimes it's just I'm tired and I want to sit on a couch and watch Netflix.
Absolutely. And going off of that too, I mean, it sounds really easy, but I'm such a proponent of prioritizing and scheduling our time, but really scheduling that personal time so that it's in my calendar. Because if you think about it, I mean, we all get stuck in our day-to-day work responsibilities, right? And I would be surprised if there were many folks on the call like that actually took that hour lunch break, right? Like that doesn't exist anymore. But what if we could schedule that 20-minute walk during our lunch hour at work, whether we are at home or whether we are at the office, and scheduling that personal time and knowing that like that's on your calendar, right? And that's too goes back to like how we can set those boundaries, demonstrate to our team members, right? So Kristen, maybe for you, it's like Pilates scheduled in your calendar. Right?
Yep.
And we
It
don't
is my
move
own,
from
it's
that.
my own damn fault, honestly. But Um, Erin, I see Jennifer's comment here, and it's a comment slash question. I think, from a supervisor, manager, leader standpoint, struggling with the balance of giving junior staff space to learn and grow with higher leadership's expectations and project deadlines. Any thoughts on that, Amelia, or any?
Well, I mean, I'm just reading it here for myself.
I feel like it has a lot to do with even the conversation you had about giving responsibility to our husbands, right? Like there's that piece that just says sometimes there's that element of trust, and I think it goes back to the trust piece a little bit too.
Well, it does, and those younger team members were hired for a reason, right? Yep. So there is that matter of like, okay, I mean, we do have to try to guide them, but we got to give them the chance too. And if they fail, well, as a leader, that's your job to navigate that situation. But we got to give them a chance.
Something I need to be better at. And I think, when you are delegating, giving that timeline. So in, that instance that Jennifer, brought up is, setting those expectations with the employee without creating fear of, this is, we're going to work, I'm going to have you work through this as, kind of the first draft, we'll work through it together. We're going to go through this together so that the next time, maybe they feel more confident on working through it. But also, I think there's a little bit of managing up too. I've had people on my team that have managed me and said, hey, you know what, I'm going to have so-and-so work on this and we're going to work on it together. Can you help me understand what a realistic timeline is? Because I want them to get this opportunity. So sometimes just having that conversation can help too. But sometimes that can't. So I understand that too.
And I feel too, and looking at that point of like higher leaders' expectations, I mean, that can be tricky as well because, my gut will say like that goes back to some of those systemic challenges. And we do all know that, not all leaders should be leaders.
Yeah.
And get into some of these positions, in different ways. So I appreciate that one because that can be challenging if, higher leadership has these really high expectations. And then you have to be that one to kind of navigate through that. So I just appreciate that as a struggle.
In the interest of appreciation, I just want to appreciate the fact that Sheila made this being here part of her own personal time blocking that she applied. So thank you, Sheila, for prioritizing Lakeside Chats. That's very sweet. And I think I want to just call out again, but Becky continues to not surprise, drop the mic on a couple things too.
I'm just dying.
Anyone knows Becky, that the concept of dropping the mic on conversations is fair, right? The women of a certain age, and I just walked away. I'm just saying no and walked away is totally the case. But
I don't think I know Becky, and I feel like I need to know Becky.
Oh, you know Becky without even needing to know Becky. Okay. Can I just say that like she's probably your spirit animal in its own way.
Okay, perfect. Becky, let's connect.
But I think to her point too is the concept of going back to the perfectionism piece, right? Was we live in that world where perfectionism, as soon as we get away from it, it rears its ugly head, right? There's the cyclical nature of when perfectionism shows up. And I think that's a fair reminder too, is that this isn't we solve the issue, we time block our lives, and that we've now eliminated the need for perfectionism in our lives. It's gonna show up again.
And that's part going back to, perfectionism being considered a personality trait. Like we don't choose to have perfectionism tendencies, right? So much of that, comes from the pressures to feel perfect, right? And that's why, society and those systemic challenges, that's part of it, right? We don't necessarily choose to have these perfection tendencies. And that's where we need to go back to that perfectionism versus excellence. Right? Are we truly a perfectionist? Right? Or do we just strive for success and are high achievers? I mean, there's a difference there.
Christy gives another good suggestion too, and I think it's a fair one too, is reminding ourselves that our phones become a part of this sort of cyclical element
Mhm.
as well. And so finding and reminding ourselves that those notifications are just as easily turned off as they are turned on. And so turning them off when it's appropriate can help us you reduce one little element of what's holding us back.
And I also love the trick of delayed send.
Yes.
In Microsoft, in Google, and most of the platforms now, you can delay send. And so as a leader, sometimes we have to work, and even as an employee, sometimes you have to work after hours to maybe catch up, or it makes you feel better. And that's the balance that you need. And so that you're not either modeling behavior that you don't want your team to have, or to Julie's Pfeiffer's comment earlier was, about setting those boundaries and those guardrails, even if it's an employee that, I need to do some work, delay send, don't send it, at night, so that they are setting those expectations, or you're setting those expectations. You're still setting those guardrails of, I choose to work right now, but I'm not going to set that expectation that's on a regular basis.
Yeah.
But
I love that.
delay send is one of my most favorite things now that I figured out how to work it. But it took me a while. My team knows that it took me a while. Sometimes I forget. Sorry, guys. All right. Any other questions or comments for Amelia or the chat before we move on?
I think we're caught up on chat.
Okay. All right. So what is, there is a lot that we have talked about here, and I'd be curious on maybe, I love accountability, and I think this, we have built a community here of Lakeside chatters. We need to come up with a name for our Lakeside people, our followers.
I like that, Lakeside chatters.
What is one small adjustment you can make to improve your work-life balance? And I'd love to, put it out there, put it in the universe. Erin makes fun of me all the time. Actually, my entire team does, but manifest it. What are you going to do to improve your work-life balance, or even balance perfectionism versus excellence?
I don't want to lose sight. And Julie, thank you for sharing. I always appreciate when people are also sharing their ways that they're gathering this information at the same time. So Julie references the Brene Brown gifts of imperfection, and I'll make sure that in the follow-up content, you guys get links back to that as well. So thank you, Julie, for sharing.
And I will say too, Brene Brown does an excellent job of kind of deciphering the differences between perfectionism and excellence. If you Google, I know I usually share it in some of my presentations, and I don't know the name of it, but if you Google Oprah Winfrey, Brene Brown, perfectionism, there's a great clip that comes out that just makes it really real. Like, she's talking about the fear of failure and how this whole idea of perfectionism is linked to what will people think. And we really have to kick that to the curb, put that idea to the back burner.
It's a hard one. It's a hard one.
It really is.
Yep.
And, for people who are on the call that know me, and Erin and Kristen, I'm such a proponent of authenticity and being your authentic self. And if we can do that, and kind of ties into what Becky's question here about people pleasers having similar traits to seeking perfection, right? Regardless, the importance of being your authentic self and whatever that means to you.
Right. Armchairs.
We
need a name for this group. I agree, Julie. We should have a contest, Erin, on what we should name our community.
I think you might have already done it with the chatters piece of it. I think that's
chatters. Yeah, I just, that you hit something that can 100% resonate with me, especially with growing up, is that what will people think? I remember that phrase coming up in my life, and now with social media too, it's even harder, because you want to put on this, perfect family, perfect, spouse, perfect friend, perfect everything. And it's tough.
And I'll say too, for those who have read my book, what do people think? You will know way more than you ever wanted to know about me by reading this book. And like one of the questions I get is like, oh my gosh, like you share some pretty personal stories in that.
Yeah.
And I do. And I've let go of that fear of what will people think, because I'm really trying to have impact and prove that we can kick perfectionism and those pressures to the curb.
I want to I think that when you're going back to that previous question and based on what you just said too, sometimes it's the idea of letting the two commingle. It's this, I mean, getting away from the concept of balance, but letting the two commingle, right? Being able to bring a little bit of work to light, or, bringing work home and talking about work with your family is another way for me that I feel like I've been able to adjust, is letting my kids and my husbands know what's happening during the day so that it doesn't feel like it's this divided line. And same of being able to bring some of what you're experiencing at life into work as well. I mean, it shows up as your truest self and to that authentic self too. And I think that finding ways where they can meet each other is important. I think not separating them sometimes can be the reason where you sort of find the imbalance.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're getting towards the end. And one of the things that when I read the book and based on our conversation too, one thing stood out to me, and I'm sure it's a quote from your book because I wrote it down, but sustainable success comes from balance, not burnout. That was one thing that I took away from today, but also from the book and our conversations earlier is, it is about that balance and figuring out what that balance means for you. And taking some of that pressure off of yourself. I think that is huge for me.
Yeah, I love that, Kristen. And that kind of goes off of what Sheila says here in the chat, which I love. I am trying to stay in my own lane.
Yes.
Can we quote that, document that, clap that, love that? That's so good. You don't have to be all things to all people.
No.
Right? So stay in your lane. I love that.
Yeah. Nobody's expecting you to. It's the pressure that you're putting on yourself to be that. So yeah, it's a phenomenal reminder of how important that is. I love Missy's comment, continue playing to the strengths of the collective team, keep unleashing all their talents, embracing good enough, progress over perfection. Kind of a drop the mic moment, Missy. I like
that.
That is great. Anybody else, any questions from the chat? I think, for me, it was a great topic, a good reminder for me, especially as a business owner, a leader, a mom, a wife, a friend, all of that. Not just, in all ways. And that's and a daughter. I lost the perfect daughter. I would highly this is a very easy book. I looked 103 pages back to front.
So we've all got our copies.
Yep. So highly recommend this book, but also following Dr. Amelia as well. I think, today we really learned about the difference between perfectionism and excellence, and that impact it can have not only on ourselves, but our teams and individuals and our family and our, anyone that surrounds us. But those strategies to shift from perfectionism to excellence, some tips and tricks to finding that work-life balance as well.
And I think holding each other accountable too, right? The idea of, I think now that the conversation's been started, and hopefully you bring this too, of reminding ourselves of how we can share and hold each other accountable to not needing to strive for perfection.
Yeah.
And I want to kind of leave a final thought too, of really challenge you all to think about where that pressure to be perfect is stemming from.
Yes.
Right? Is it the pressure that we're putting on ourselves? And if so, please, for the love, try to let that go, right? Because perfectionism does not exist, right? It's going to set us up for failure. So think about where that pressure is coming from. And if you make a more cognizant effort of that too, you'll start to notice, and I'd love for you to either reach out on LinkedIn or send me an email, the societal piece, right? And you'll notice too, like in the book, I talk a lot about the societal pressures that we're faced with, being a good mom, being able to breastfeed our kids, being the perfect wife. That's really important. That society piece is really, really key to a lot of the conversations around perfectionism.
Agreed. Well, Erin, I'm excited about this next Lakeside chat. I know you're going to be facilitating this discussion. I'm Gary Braun from Pivotal Advisors and Derek Moe of Select Metrics. Pivotal is a good friend of Lakeside Chat, as well as Derek. And so do you want to talk a little bit about what's coming up on Tuesday, April 22nd?
Yeah, I feel like this sounds like it's a big pivot from this conversation to where we're headed in April, but hence the way Lakeside Chats work. Like we throw something soft and meta, and then we're gonna go to something that feels a little more hard and work specific. So one of the things, obviously, as Director of Business Development in my own role, and working with a lot of organizations that Lakeside works with on a regular basis, is we're often talking to employers around how their sales team is set up, and who are they hiring to make sure that they're rounding out their sales team. And so we're bringing in two really great experts to really talk about the front end of bringing on and creating a sales team, with the concept of being able to set up sales for success, which ultimately means setting up companies for success as well. So excited to pivot and have a conversation that looks slightly different than what we talked about today, but through the same vein. And we expect you all coming back with questions, comments, and your experience as well.
Agreed. And Amelia, thank you. This was truly a gift to have you on. Thank you for being my first guest in facilitating Lakeside Chats. And I thought it was a perfect one to lead, because I did not need to be perfect, but I do think it was excellent. So thank you. Thank you, everybody on the chat. And if you do have any other questions for any of us, feel free to reach out. And we do look forward to next month as well. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.